In the unforgiving heartland, where fortunes are built on grit and destroyed by greed, a new legend is about to be told. Fate has a cruel way of giving us exactly what we need at the moment we least expect it. Before the harvest begins, offer your tribute. If you believe in the triumph of the underdog, show your support with a like. Join our community by subscribing so you won't miss the secrets buried in the land. Now prepare yourselves. The fire was dying. Elias watched the last embers shrink into themselves, glowing like the resentful eyes of a predator admitting defeat. Outside, the world had vanished. The blizzard wasn't just a storm. It was an erasure, a thick white curtain dropped by a merciless god. It had been snowing for 2 days straight, a horizontal assault of ice and wind that had buried his fences, suffocated the landscape, and now was slowly claiming the house itself. The windows were frosted over, not with delicate filigree, but with a solid cataract of ice. The wind howled a low, mournful dirge through the eaves of the old ranch house, a sound Elias had once found comforting, the sound of home bracing against the world. Now it was just the soundtrack to the end. He hadn't bothered to bring in more wood. The pile sat under a tarp by the back door, buried beneath 4 feet of snow, a monument to his own inertia. He could dig it out. The strength was still there, coiled in the dense, tired muscle of his shoulders and back. He just didn't have the will. The will had been the first thing to freeze, long before the storm hit. The foreclosure notice from the bank lay on the scarred pine table, a single white rectangle in the gloom. Final. Irrevocable. The storm was just punctuation on a sentence written in the sterile, unforgiving ink of a loan default. There are truths that only reveal themselves when everything we know falls apart. And the truth for Elias was this: he was done. The fight had bled out of him drop by painful drop over the last 2 years. He had buried his wife, Sarah, in the small plot on the hill overlooking the valley, the cancer having consumed her as voraciously as the bank was now consuming their legacy. He had watched his daughter, Lily, pack her bags a year after that, her bright, capable eyes clouded with a pity that felt sharper than any accusation. She couldn't watch him wither, couldn't stay in a house so saturated with ghosts. She had a life to build in the city, away from the dust and the debt and the hollowed-out man her father had become. He couldn't blame her. He had become a ghost himself, haunting the rooms where laughter once echoed. Now the ranch, the last piece of them, the last piece of a Thorne family legacy stretching back over a century, was being taken. So let the fire die. Let the cold creep in. It was a fitting end. Quiet, numb, just like the inside of his chest. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the worn leather of his father's armchair, the same chair his father had died in, and waited for the cold to take him. Boom. Elias' eyes shot open. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the wind, which moaned and shrieked. This was a solid, percussive impact against the front door, heavy enough to rattle the last remaining dishes in the kitchen cabinet. He sat upright, every nerve ending long dormant, suddenly crackling with a painful, unwelcome life. Adrenaline, a forgotten poison, flooded his veins. Who in God's name would be out in this? The county plows wouldn't be out for another day, at least. No one could get up his long, winding driveway. Boom, boom. It was frantic now. A desperate, powerful thudding that spoke of a panic as vast and cold as the storm itself. A snowplow driver run off the road. A lost traveler succumbing to the White Death. For the first time in a year, a flicker of something other than despair sparked in his gut. It wasn't compassion. It was raw, undiluted annoyance. He hated people. He didn't want to see them, talk to them, and certainly not save them. He had wanted to be left alone to die. He ignored it, a grim satisfaction settling in. Let the storm have them. It was having him after all. Boom, crack. a sound like the splintering timber of a ship breaking apart. The old oak door, the one his grandfather had hung with his own hands 100 years ago, was giving way. A low, guttural sound followed, a noise that vibrated through the floorboards, a sound of immense distress that was not human. It was animal. Elias was on his feet before his mind consented, the lethargy burned away by a lifetime of instinct. A rancher's soul, buried but not dead, responded to the cry of a creature in peril. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, its cold weight a familiar reassurance, and moved toward the door, his heart hammering a frantic, alien rhythm against his ribs. He peered through the small peephole, but it was iced over, blind. With a grunt of effort that tore at his unused vocal cords, he drew back the heavy deadbolt and turned the handle. The wind tore the door from his grip, slamming it open against the inside wall with a concussive force. And in the swirling vortex of snow and darkness stood a nightmare, or a miracle. He couldn't decide. It was a horse, but that word was insufficient, an insult to the reality before him. It was a monument carved from muscle and midnight, a creature of myth pulled from the pages of a forgotten legend. It stood a good 20 hands high at the withers, its magnificent head nearly touching the top of the doorframe. Its coat was the color of polished jet, dusted with a fine layer of snow that made it seem as if it were carved from obsidian and sprinkled with diamonds. Its eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, glowed with an unnerving, impossible intelligence. Steam plumed from its flared nostrils in the frigid air like smoke from a furnace. And behind it, huddled against its massive legs for shelter, were two foals shivering violently, their small bodies weak, their coats matted with ice. The giant stallion took a hesitant step forward, its massive hoof clattering on the welcome mat. It lowered its head, a gesture of profound supplication, and nudged the splintered doorframe, a clear, desperate plea that needed no language. Elias stood frozen, poker in hand, staring at the impossible creature. His rule, the one he'd lived by since Lily left, was simple: let the world go to hell. Don't get involved. But this wasn't the world. This was something else. This was a plea from a being as lost and broken as he was, a being fighting for its family against the end of all things. The stallion let out a low, pleading whicker, a sound that seemed to tear from its very soul, and one of the foals, the smaller of the two, collapsed into the snowdrift piling up in his doorway. The man who had been ready to freeze to death just moments before felt a dam break inside him, a torrent of some forgotten, buried emotion. He lowered the poker. "All right," he rasped, his voice raw and cracked from disuse. "All right. Come in, you damn fools." He had to use a pry bar and a sledgehammer to break away a section of the historic doorframe, an act of destruction that felt more like a consecration. Only then could the stallion's massive shoulders pass through. The creature moved with a cautious, intelligent grace that belied its size, nudging its foals ahead of it into the relative warmth of the living room. The door was a wreck, but Elias managed to wedge it shut against the screaming wind, stuffing old blankets and Sarah's winter coats into the gaps. The silence that fell afterward was surreal, a pocket of stillness in a world of chaos, broken only by the pathetic, uncontrolled shivering of the foals and the heavy, exhausted breathing of the stallion. They were in his house, 3 horses, in his living room. The stallion stood over its young, a living mountain of protective flesh, its dark eyes scanning every corner of the room, from the sagging ceiling to the worn floorboards, assessing threats with a methodical focus. The foals, one a dark colt like its sire, the other a filly the color of winter cream, huddled together, their small bodies trembling so violently it seemed their bones might shake apart. Elias stared, the sheer, crushing impossibility of the situation slowly sinking in. His grandfather's braided rug, his wife's rocking chair, the stone fireplace built by his own father, and a trio of impossible horses. The stallion's gaze eventually settled on him. There was no fear in those eyes anymore, only a deep, penetrating intelligence and a profound weariness that seemed to echo his own. It was a look that stripped away the years of grime and grief, a look that saw right through his hardened shell to the hollow, aching space beneath. He realized they were freezing, their coats caked with ice that was now beginning to melt and puddle on the floor. Acting on pure, buried instinct, he moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He grabbed every old towel and blanket he could find from the linen closet, his movements stiff but purposeful. He approached the stallion slowly, holding out a threadbare quilt Sarah had made. The great horse watched his every move, unblinking, its muscles tense, but it didn't shy away as Elias gently began to rub down its massive flank, the ice cracking and falling away in sheets. The animal shuddered, not from cold, but from what felt like a wave of profound relief. It let out a soft, low rumble deep in its chest, a sound of visceral gratitude that vibrated through Elias' hands. He worked for over an hour, drying the stallion and then the two foals, his old aches and pains, the arthritis in his knuckles, the constant throb in his lower back forgotten, burned away by the immediate critical need. The small filly nudged his hand with her soft nose, a gesture of trusting innocence that struck him like a physical blow to the chest. It was the first gentle touch he'd felt in years. He realized they must be starving, their ribs stark beneath their wet coats. The ranch was barren, the feed stores long since emptied and the accounts closed. His own pantry was a testament to his apathy. He had a half-eaten loaf of stale bread, a few wizened apples from last fall, and a bag of carrots meant for a stew he'd never had the energy to make. It was his last food. Without a second thought, he brought it all out on a tin plate. He laid the food on the floor in front of them. The foals fell on the carrots and apples with ravenous, desperate whines, their small mouths working frantically. The stallion, however, did not eat. It watched its young devour the food, its gaze soft and patient. Then it looked at Elias and with its nose, gently pushed a single, bruised apple toward his feet. The gesture was so deliberate, so human, that Elias felt his throat tighten into a knot of emotion he couldn't name. The beast, starving and exhausted, was offering to share the last of the food with its host. He shook his head, pushing the apple back with the toe of his worn boot. "You eat," he managed to say, his voice thick. "You need it more." He sank back into his armchair, the physical and emotional exhaustion hitting him like a tidal wave. The fire was nearly out, just a few winking coals left, their faint light a poor defense against the gloom. He was too tired to move, too tired to care. The cold began to seep back into his bones. He closed his eyes, the image of the foreclosure notice swimming in his mind. It was still over. This strange, beautiful, impossible interruption didn't change a single damning fact. As he drifted into a shallow, shivering sleep, he felt a warmth press against him, a solid, living heat. He opened his eyes to see the massive stallion had moved, positioning its enormous body between him and the drafty, broken door, a living shield against the storm. It lowered its great head, resting it gently on the arm of the chair, its warm breath ghosting over Elias' chapped, cold hands. The two foals, their bellies full, curled up on the rug near the hearth, leaning against each other for warmth and comfort. The stallion's dark, intelligent eye watched him, a silent, steady sentinel in the encroaching darkness. For the first time since Sarah's death, Elias didn't feel alone in the cavernous silence of the house. He felt guarded. He slept, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't dream of loss. He dreamed of a giant, silent shadow standing guard in the dark, and for the first time in a long time, he was not afraid. The world was born again in blinding white. When Elias awoke, the storm had broken. Sunlight, brilliant and unforgiving, streamed through the ice-caked windows, reflecting off the pristine, sculpted snow with an intensity that made him squint and groan. His neck was a column of stiff, protesting muscle, but he was warm. The stallion was still beside him, a living furnace that had shielded him through the coldest hours of the night. The great horse lifted its head as he stirred, nickering softly, a gentle inquiry. The foals were on their feet, exploring the living room with the clumsy, endearing curiosity of the young, the filly occasionally batting at a loose tassel on the rug, while the colt attempted to chew on the leg of a wooden table. The scene was so utterly domestic, so absurdly normal that Elias almost laughed. A dry, rasping sound escaped his lips. Then he remembered the foreclosure, the broken door, the empty pantry. The cold dread returned, a familiar, heavy weight settling in his stomach. The beautiful creatures were a temporary reprieve, a dream from which he was now waking into a harsher reality. He knew he had to get them out before anyone saw them. Questions would be asked, questions he couldn't possibly answer. Who owned them? Where did they come from? A creature of this size and majesty wasn't some stray Mustang. He had just managed to heave himself to his feet, his joints popping in protest, when he heard it. The low, mechanical growl of powerful engines, far too powerful for a local pickup or the county sheriff. He moved to the window, his heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat. He rubbed a clear patch in the frost with the heel of his hand. Two vehicles were making their way up his long, unplowed driveway. They were matte black, militaristic SUVs with tinted windows and oversized, deep-tread tires that chewed through the 4-foot snowdrifts like they were nothing. They weren't from around here. A cold knot of apprehension tightened in his gut. This was trouble of a kind he had never known. The stallion sensed his fear before he even made a sound. It moved silently to stand behind him, a dark, protective shadow at his shoulder, its muscles tensed and coiled. The SUVs pulled to a stop 30 yards from the house, their engines idling with a low, predatory hum. 4 men got out. They were dressed in identical black tactical gear, their faces hard and emotionless, obscured by wraparound sunglasses despite the glare from the snow. They moved with a disciplined, cold efficiency that screamed military or something much colder. One of them, clearly the leader, walked toward the house, his boots crunching loudly in the unnerving post-storm silence. Elias' mind raced. These weren't neighbors. They weren't from the bank. They were hunters. He instinctively knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, they were here for the horses. He shoved the stallion back from the door, his voice a harsh, urgent hiss. "Get back. All of you, into the kitchen. Now." To his astonishment, the horse obeyed instantly, as if it understood every word. It nudged its foals into the adjoining room and out of sight, its own body blocking them from view. Elias took a deep, shuddering breath, schooling his features into a mask of weary, rural indifference, and opened the splintered door a crack. The leader stood on his porch, a tablet computer in his gloved hand. He was tall, built like a battering ram, with a thin, white scar that cut through one eyebrow, and eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. "Morning," the man said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth or regional accent. "We're a corporate recovery team. A transport vehicle carrying a high-value asset was overturned in the storm a few miles from here. We're tracking it." The man didn't wait for a response, his arrogance a palpable force. He tapped the screen of the tablet and turned it toward Elias. On it was a high-resolution photograph of the stallion. It was pictured in a sterile, white enclosure, lit by harsh fluorescent lights. Wires and sensors were attached to its flank. It looked magnificent but also like a prisoner, a specimen under a microscope. "This is the asset," the man continued, his tone suggesting the horse was no different from a piece of machinery, a lost shipment of microchips. Designation XB7. It's a proprietary genetic prototype owned by Sterling Biogen, extremely valuable and extremely dangerous. It's not a normal animal. If you see it, do not approach. Just call us. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air on his face. Asset XB7. The words were a desecration, a violation. He looked from the cold, clinical image on the screen to the memory of the creature that had guarded him all night, the animal that had offered him its last apple. He forced his voice to be steady, raspy. "Never seen it before. Nothing out here but snow and quiet." The man's gray eyes narrowed, scanning Elias' face, searching for a crack in his facade, for the telltale flicker of a lie. He glanced past Elias, toward the broken door frame. "You have some storm damage." "Termites," Elias lied without blinking, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Old house. Wind found the weak spot." The man wasn't convinced. His gaze swept over the yard, a methodical, predatory scan, then stopped, fixated on something near the porch. Hoof prints. The stallion's massive tracks, partially obscured by blowing snow but still damningly visible. They led directly to the front door. The man's eyes flicked back to Elias, a flicker of cold triumph in them. "Looks like you had a big visitor." Elias' heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He had to think fast. "My neighbor's Clydesdale broke through its fence in the storm, came looking for shelter. Huge, dumb as a post. Sent it packing this morning when the sun came up." It was a flimsy lie, but the only one he had. There were no neighbors with Clydesdales for 20 miles. But this man didn't know that. Not yet. The leader, who Elias would soon know as Mr. Graves, stared at him for a long, silent moment. Elias could feel the weight of that gaze, dissecting him, judging him, weighing his pathetic lie against the evidence. The man finally gave a curt, dismissive nod, though his eyes remained steeped in skepticism. "Right. Well, if your neighbor's Clydesdale shows up again, you give us a call." He handed Elias a black business card. It was made of a strange, metallic material, cold to the touch. It was blank except for a name, Mr. Graves, and a single, untraceable satellite phone number. "We're offering a substantial reward for any information leading to its recovery. $250,000. Don't be a hero. It's worth more than this entire ranch, termites and all." With a final, lingering look that was a clear, unspoken threat, Graves turned and walked back to the SUV. The black vehicles turned around with unnerving precision and drove away, leaving deep, ugly ruts in the pristine snow, a scar on the land. Elias watched them go, his hand trembling as he clutched the card. He closed the door, his back pressing against the splintered wood, his legs weak. The stallion emerged from the kitchen, its intelligent eyes full of a concern that was profoundly, shockingly human. Elias looked at the magnificent creature, then at the black card in his hand, the truth of the situation crashing down on him with the force of an avalanche. He was harboring a secret worth more money than he had ever dreamed of, a secret its owners would clearly kill to protect. He was a dead man sheltering a miracle, and he knew, with absolute certainty, they would be back. The departure of the black SUV did little to ease the tension coiling in Elias' stomach. It only confirmed the terrible stakes. He was no longer just a man waiting to lose his home. He was a man hiding a fugitive in a glass house. He spent the day patching the door as best he could with old planks from the collapsing barn, his mind racing. The mercenaries, he refused to think of them as a recovery team, would be back. The lie about the Clydesdale was a flimsy shield, a tissue paper defense against a battering ram. They would check records, satellite images, talk to the clerk at the feed store in town. They would know he was lying within hours. He needed to hide the horses, all of them. But where? The barn was a death trap, its roof groaning under the weight of the snow, ready to collapse at any moment. The house was the only sanctuary they had, and it was the first place they would look. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the snow-covered plains, a masterpiece of color and cold, Elias found himself simply watching the horses. He had spent his entire life around animals, raised on this very ranch, but he had never seen anything like the stallion. It wasn't just its impossible size or its stark, midnight beauty. It was the depth of its awareness. When Elias paced, the horse's head would follow him, its gaze analytical. When his thoughts turned dark and he slumped into his armchair, the weight of his predicament crushing him, the stallion would approach and nudge his shoulder with its soft nose, a silent inquiry, a gesture of support. It seemed to understand his moods, to mirror his anxiety with its own watchful stillness. It was a partner in this crisis, not just a passenger. The foals, having recovered their strength from their terrifying ordeal, were a different story. They were pure, unadulterated life, a chaotic dance of innocence in the confines of his rustic, decaying home. The little cream-colored filly developed a deep fascination with her own reflection in the darkened glass of the television screen, nudging it with her nose, and then skittering back in surprise when her twin moved with her. The colt, bolder and more reckless, discovered that the tassels on Sarah's old throw blanket were perfect for chewing. Elias found he didn't have the heart to stop them. Their quiet, playful mischief was the first sign of real life in this house of ghosts in over 2 years. The sound of their tiny hooves on the floorboards was a balm on his raw soul. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He sat in his armchair, the shotgun he hadn't touched in a decade resting across his lap, its cold steel a grim comfort. He watched the stallion. The great horse stood near the main window, a motionless silhouette against the brilliant, moonlit snow, its head cocked as if listening to the secrets of the night, to the whisper of distant engines. It was on guard, protecting its young, protecting him. This creature, hunted and terrified, was standing sentinel over the broken man who had given it shelter. The absurdity and the profound honor of it all made Elias' chest ache with an emotion he couldn't name. He knew he had to understand more. Who were these people from Sterling Biogen? What had they done to this magnificent animal to make it so intelligent, so aware? With the foals finally asleep in a heap at its feet, Elias approached the stallion cautiously, speaking in a low, soothing murmur he hadn't used since Lily was a child afraid of thunderstorms. "Easy now, big fella, just want to take a look at you." The horse turned its massive head, its liquid eyes fixing on him, but it remained calm, a silent consent. Elias ran a hand down its powerful neck, feeling the thick, velvet-smooth coat, the incredible power rippling beneath the skin. As his hand moved over its left flank, his fingers brushed against something hard and unnatural beneath the hair. He gently parted the fur, his breath caught in his throat. There, seared into the horse's dark hide, was a brand. It wasn't a rancher's mark, not a symbol of ownership born of the land. It was a sterile corporate logo, a stylized double helix enclosed in a sharp-edged circle, and below it a series of alphanumeric characters, XB7. Asset XB7. The designation Graves had used, a slave's name. Beneath the brand, embedded just under the skin, he felt a small, hard disc. A tag, a GPS tracker. His blood ran cold. They could probably see him right now, a blip on a screen in some high-tech command center. They were just waiting, playing with him. But the tag felt cold, inert. Had the brutal cold of the storm fried its circuits, or had the horse, in its desperate flight, somehow disabled it? The possibilities were equally terrifying. He knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, that he needed to get it out. He went to his workshop, his hands shaking slightly, and returned with a small toolkit and a bottle of veterinary antiseptic. "This might hurt," he whispered, holding up a sharp utility knife he kept honed for cutting twine. The stallion watched him, its nostrils flaring slightly as it smelled the antiseptic, but it stood perfectly still, its trust in him absolute. It seemed to understand what he was doing, and why. With a surgeon's focus he didn't know he possessed, born of a desperate need to protect, Elias made a small, precise incision over the tag. The horse flinched, its skin quivering, but it did not pull away. He carefully worked the small metal disc free from the muscle and tissue. It was about the size of a quarter, cold and lifeless. There was a tiny red light on its surface that was now dark, shattered, damaged. Thank God. He cleaned the small wound with the antiseptic, his touch as gentle as he could make it. As he worked, the stallion lowered its great head and rested it on his shoulder, its warm breath on his neck. It was a gesture of such profound trust and vulnerability that Elias felt his own carefully constructed defenses crumble to dust. This animal, this lab experiment, was more noble and more feeling than any human he had met in years. He looked from the cold, metallic tag in his hand, the symbol of its bondage, to the warm, living creature beside him. The choice was no longer a choice. It was a duty, a covenant. He wasn't just hiding a stray anymore. He was protecting a life, a family. He would not let them take him. He would not let them turn this sentient, empathetic being back into Asset XB7. He would die first. The thought did not frighten him. For the first time in a very long time, the thought of dying for a reason felt infinitely better than dying for none at all. The next day passed in a state of hypervigilance. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching engine. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the shape of a man in black tactical gear. Elias knew they would be back. His lie about the Clydesdale was a ticking bomb. They would have checked with the county records office, with the local feed and tax supply. They would know he was the last rancher on this mountain, that his nearest neighbor was miles away, and that no one in this desolate region owned a Clydesdale. They would realize he was lying. He spent the morning trying to obscure the tracks around the house, using a shovel and a wide broom to sweep and disturb the snow, but it was a futile, desperate effort. The stallion's hooves were enormous, the imprints deep and distinct. A child could track it. He felt a rising panic, a cold, acidic helplessness he hadn't felt since he'd sat by Sarah's hospital bed, watching the numbers on the monitors fall, powerless to stop the inevitable. He was one old man with a rusty shotgun and a broken heart, against a faceless, billion-dollar corporation with military-grade resources. The horses seemed to sense his growing despair. The stallion stayed close, a constant, reassuring presence, occasionally nudging his arm as if to say, "We are in this together." The foals, normally playful, were subdued, sticking close to their sire's powerful legs. He was their protector, and in his own mind he was failing. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, it happened. The low growl of engines returned, louder this time, more numerous. He ran to the window, his breath fogging the cold glass. It wasn't 2 SUVs anymore. It was 4. They fanned out at the bottom of his driveway, creating a perfect, menacing blockade. Then 2 more appeared from the west, coming across the open fields, their black frames stark and predatory against the endless white. They were surrounding him, cutting off every possible route of escape. A voice, amplified by a bullhorn, cut through the cold, still air, metallic and devoid of emotion. It was Graves. "Elias Thorne, we know it's in there. We tracked the asset's residual biological markers to this location. The tag may be offline, but we have other ways. Your lie about the Clydesdale was insulting. Elias' heart sank into his boots. Biological markers. Of course. They probably had drones, satellites, technology he couldn't even begin to imagine. He had never stood a chance. The stallion moved to his side, letting out a low, angry rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It understood the voice. It knew the hunters had returned. "Listen to me, old man," the bullhorn blared, the voice laced with a cold, impatient fury. "This does not have to get difficult. That is not your property. It is a stolen corporate asset valued at over $50 million. It is a dangerous, unpredictable biological construct. You are interfering with a lawful recovery operation. Open the door and step outside with your hands in the air. We will not harm you." The lie was so blatant it was almost comical. These men radiated violence like heat from an engine. He looked around his small, cluttered living room, the threadbare armchair, the faded photograph of Sarah and Lily on the mantelpiece, their smiles from a better time, the magnificent, impossible creature standing beside him like a brother in arms. This was all he had left in the world. A house he was about to lose, and a family of fugitives he had known for 2 days. The choice was so clear it wasn't a choice at all. "Give us the asset, old man," the voice from the bullhorn commanded, its patience clearly evaporated. "It's worth more than your life." Elias picked up the shotgun from where it leaned against the wall. He knew it was a pathetic, foolish gesture against their firepower, but it was his. He looked the stallion in the eye, seeing his own defiant resolve mirrored there. "I guess they're wrong about that," he said, his voice quiet but steady. He would not let them win. He would not let them take this family. This was his land. This was his home. This was where the Thorne family made its stand. The siege began not with a bang, but with a chilling, methodical precision. The dozen men in black fanned out, creating a perfect perimeter around the house. They moved like a pack of wolves, silent and coordinated, using hand signals, their black assault rifles held at the ready. Elias watched them from the window, his knuckles white on the worn stock of his old 12-gauge. He felt a strange calm settle over him. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his belly, but it was overshadowed by a defiant, burning rage. This was his land, bought with the sweat and blood of 3 generations of Thornes. This was his home. They would not take it without a fight. The stallion stood directly behind him, its muscles bunched like coiled springs, its breath hot on the back of his neck. It was no longer just a protector. It was a warrior waiting for the battle. The air in the room was thick with a shared, silent understanding. "Elias Thorne, this is your final warning," Graves's amplified voice boomed across the snow. "Come out now, or we will be forced to breach." Elias didn't move. He wasn't going to walk out into their guns. He would make his stand here in the place where he had built a life, and where, just 2 days ago, he had planned to end it. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the shouting. It was the silence of a decision being made. Then, a heavy, metallic thunk echoed from the front of the house, followed by the splintering of the old planks he'd nailed across the doorway. They were using a battering ram. He backed away from the window, leveling the shotgun at the entrance, his cheek pressed against the cold wood of the stock. "Get the little ones in the back," he grunted at the stallion, not taking his eyes off the door. The great horse needed no further instruction. It nudged its foals with its head, guiding them urgently toward the rear bedroom, then positioned its own body to shield the doorway, a living barricade. The front door crashed inward, torn from its hinges and the makeshift repairs, and the first black-clad figure stormed through, rifle raised. Elias fired. The blast of the shotgun was deafening in the enclosed space. The mercenary, Hit square in the chest with a load of rock salt. Elias couldn't bring himself to use buckshot. Not yet. Was thrown backward with a grunt of pain and surprise, his body armor absorbing the impact but knocking the wind clean out of him. He stumbled back out the door, collapsing into the snow. A second man followed, smarter, staying low. He fired a controlled burst from his rifle, the bullets chewing a vicious line of holes through the wall just above Elias' head, showering him with plaster dust and splinters. Elias ducked behind the armchair, his ears ringing, the smell of cordite sharp in his nostrils. He was old, too old for this. He fumbled to reload, his fingers clumsy and slow with cold and adrenaline. He could hear them shouting outside, coordinating their assault, their voices cold and professional. Two more men breached through a side window, shattering the glass that had survived the storm. They had him flanked. It was over. One of them advanced on him, the barrel of his rifle pointed directly at Elias' head. "Drop it, Grandpa." Elias stared up the dark, unforgiving barrel, his heart pounding in his throat. He had failed. He closed his eyes, a final image of Sarah's smile flashing in his mind, waiting for the end. But the end didn't come. A sound erupted from the back of the house that was primal and terrifying, a sound born in the deepest pits of hell. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated fury, a sound that no horse should ever make. The stallion exploded from the bedroom doorway, a force of nature unleashed. It wasn't a prey animal anymore. It was a predator, an avenging angel of righteous wrath. Its eyes burned with a cold, intelligent fire. The mercenary who had been advancing on Elias didn't even have time to scream. The stallion's front hooves, hard as stone and shod in generations of wild instinct, lashed out with blurring speed. The impact sent the man flying through the air as if he'd been hit by a truck. He crashed through the drywall of the far wall, leaving a perfect, human-sized hole, and landed in a heap in the kitchen, motionless. The second man who had come through the window raised his rifle, his face a mask of shocked disbelief, but he was far too slow. The stallion spun on its hind legs, a maneuver of impossible agility, its powerful back legs kicking out with piston-like force. The blow caught the man in the side, the sound of ribs cracking audible even over the chaos. He was thrown sideways, smashing into the stone fireplace with a sickening crunch. The two mercenaries in the doorway stood frozen for a half-second, their professional composure shattered, their faces pale with shock. This wasn't in their training manual. They had come for an asset, a docile lab animal. They were facing a demon forged in shadow and rage. The stallion charged. It was a terrifying spectacle of focused, tactical fury. It ducked its head, using its massive shoulder to slam one man back out the door, then reared up to its full, terrifying height, its hooves flashing in the dim light, striking the other in the helmet with a clang of metal on metal that sent him staggering backward, dazed and disoriented. Chaos erupted. The house became a whirlwind of splintering furniture, panicked shouting, and the thunder of hooves on wood. The mercenaries were trained for combat against men, not against a 1,000-pound beast of impossible speed and intelligence inside a confined space. It moved with a brutal efficiency, using the tight quarters to its advantage, its bulk becoming a weapon. It kicked, it bit, it slammed them into walls. It was a living battering ram of righteous anger. Elias watched, stunned, from behind the dubious safety of the armchair. He saw the stallion clear the room of immediate threats, then turn its attention back to him. The great horse trotted over, its sides heaving, its eyes wild but clear. It nudged him, then gently but firmly gripped the collar of his thick flannel shirt with its teeth, and began to drag him toward the back of the house, away from the broken door and the groaning, wounded men, pulling him to safety. As the stallion dragged Elias toward the relative safety of the kitchen, the sounds from outside changed. The panicked shouts of the mercenaries were joined by a new noise, a high, piercing call that seemed to echo off the snow-covered hills. It was the filly, her voice a desperate, whistling cry for help. The colt joined in, his call deeper, more frantic. They were calling out into the vast, empty wilderness. Elias thought it was a hopeless, tragic gesture. Who could possibly hear them? Then an answer came. It started as a low rumble, a vibration in the frozen earth that Elias could feel through the soles of his boots. It grew steadily, a thunderous drumming that was not the sound of engines or gunfire. It was the sound of hooves, hundreds of them. From the small kitchen window, Elias saw it. Cresting the hill to the west, a dark, surging wave against the white snow, was a herd. But it wasn't a herd of wild mustangs. These were creatures like the stallion, massive and dark, their forms powerful and otherworldly. There were mares, their eyes fierce and protective, and other great stallions, their heads held high, their manes like black banners in the wind. They were the rest of the escaped experiments, a hidden tribe of genetic titans who had found refuge and built a life in the desolate, forgotten corners of the wilderness. They had heard the call of the young, and they were coming. The cavalry had arrived. The mercenaries outside, attempting to regroup from the shocking, brutal assault inside the house, turned to face the new threat. Their faces, visible through their helmet visors, were etched with disbelief and a dawning, primal fear. They had been hunting one asset. Now they were facing an army of them. The herd didn't slow. They charged down the hill, their hooves churning the deep snow into a blizzard of their own making. They were a living avalanche of muscle and fury. They flowed around the black SUVs, their massive bodies rocking the vehicles on their heavy-duty suspensions. They weren't attacking the men directly. Their movements were strategic, intelligent, a display of coordinated power. They were blocking them, hurting them, cutting off their escape routes with a terrifying, silent precision. The lead stallion of the wild herd, a beast that seemed even larger and more scarred than the one in Elias' house, reared up, its silhouette blotting out the afternoon sun. It let out a challenging roar that was a clear and unambiguous command. Leave. The mercenaries were soldiers, men trained to face down danger without flinching. But this was something beyond their comprehension. This was a myth come to life. They were surrounded by monsters from a forgotten age. Panic, cold, and absolute broke their discipline. They scrambled back into their SUVs, their retreat clumsy and chaotic. One man dropped his rifle in the snow and didn't bother to retrieve it. Engines roared to life with a desperate whine. The black trucks tried to reverse, to turn, but the herd was a fluid, impassable wall, boxing them in, forcing them back down the long driveway the way they had come. It was a masterful display of coordinated intimidation. The herd didn't need to trample them. Their sheer, overwhelming presence was enough. Elias watched from the window, his hand resting on the neck of the stallion beside him, and felt a sense of awe that pushed out all the fear. He was witnessing the birth of a new and powerful force in this world, a force that man had created but could no longer control. The SUVs finally broke free, fishtailing on the slick snow as they sped away, not stopping until they were distant, black specks on the horizon. They fled, not as soldiers completing a tactical retreat, but as terrified men who had seen something that would haunt their nightmares for the rest of their lives. The wild herd watched them go, their powerful forms standing like ancient, unmovable statues in the snow. Then, as one, they turned their collective attention to the small, broken ranch house. The great lead stallion walked slowly forward, its gaze fixed on the stallion standing with Elias. A low, rumbling nicker passed between them, a conversation, a reunion, a confirmation. The family was whole again. In the aftermath, a profound silence descended upon the ranch, broken only by the gentle nickering of the horses and the whistle of the wind through the broken window panes. The wild herd remained at a distance, a silent, watchful perimeter of obsidian guardians against the vast white canvas of the land. The interior of the house was a wreck, splintered furniture, gaping holes in the walls, shattered glass crunching underfoot. But it felt more like a home than it had in years. It felt consecrated, a battlefield where something vital had been defended and won. Elias, nursing a collection of bruises and a deep, soul-shaking exhaustion, moved through the debris, his mind struggling to process the impossible events of the last hour. He was no longer just a failed rancher. He was an accomplice, a guardian, a witness to a miracle. The stallion, his protector, stayed close, its earlier fury replaced by a gentle, watchful calm. The foals emerged from the bedroom and began to explore the wreckage with wide-eyed curiosity. Their innocence, a stark, beautiful contrast to the violence that had just occurred. Elias knew the mercenaries, or the faceless corporation they worked for, would be back. Sterling Biogen wouldn't give up on a $50 million asset, let alone an entire herd of them. But next time they wouldn't come with a small tactical team. They would come with something bigger, more powerful, helicopters, the National Guard. They would spin a story about a dangerous biological contagion. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it ignited a spark of cold, hard purpose in the hollowed-out landscape of his soul. He looked out at the herd, at the magnificent creatures who had answered the call. They were a new species, a new breed born in a sterile lab but perfected in the crucible of the wild. They were intelligent, empathetic, and fiercely protective. They were a family, and they needed a sanctuary. Standing there amidst the ruins of his living room, Elias Thorne, the man who had been ready to die in the cold, found a reason to live in the fire. He would not let the bank take this land. He would not let the corporation reclaim these animals. This ranch, this forgotten piece of land that held only ghosts and painful memories, would be reborn. It would become a refuge, a protected place where this new breed could live, safe from the greed and fear of men like Graves. The foreclosure, the debt, the crushing weight of his failure, it all seemed manageable now. They were just problems to be solved, obstacles to be overcome. He had a purpose that was bigger than his own grief. He would fight. He would use the knowledge the world had forced upon him. He would use their own weapons, secrecy and information against them. He would expose Sterling Biogen. He would tell the world the story of Asset XB7, the creature who wasn't a thing, but a being who had saved him. He looked at the stallion, who nudged his hand gently. He looked at the foals, who had started a clumsy game of tag around a broken chair leg. He looked out at the wild herd, their quiet strength a promise etched against the horizon. This was his new family. This was his new legacy. He wouldn't just save the ranch. He would build a kingdom for them. The first step, he knew, would be the hardest. He had to make a call, not to a lawyer, not yet. He had to call his daughter. The thought of calling Lily sent a tremor of fear through him that the mercenaries had failed to incite. It had been 6 months since they had last spoken, a strained, painful conversation where her pleas for him to sell the ranch and move closer to the city had been met with his stubborn, sullen silence. How could he explain any of this? "Hello, Lily. I know you think I'm losing my mind, but I've adopted a family of genetically engineered super horses and am currently harboring them from a ruthless Black Ops team." She would think he'd finally snapped. She would call the sheriff, social services. She would try to save him from himself, and in doing so, doom them all. He found the abandoned rifle in the snow where the terrified mercenary had dropped it. It was a state-of-the-art piece of military hardware, unmarked except for a small serial number. This, he thought, was proof. This was his leverage. He spent 2 days cleaning the house, boarding up the windows and door, and watching the herd. They were magnificent. They moved with a collective intelligence, the lead stallion directing their movements as they grazed on the tough winter grasses beneath the snow. The stallion Elias, now simply called Titan, stayed with him, a constant companion. The foals had claimed the house as their own, their playful energy a constant source of wonder. He finally made the call. He found an old burned phone he'd kept from his brief, paranoid phase after Sarah's diagnosis, when he'd been convinced the insurance companies were listening to his calls. He dialed the number from memory. She answered on the second ring. "Dad." Her voice was a mixture of surprise and concern. "Dad, is everything okay? I was so worried with the storm." "I'm fine, Lily, I'm okay." "You don't sound okay." "What's wrong?" He took a deep breath. "I need you to listen to me. Really listen. Don't interrupt and don't immediately think I'm crazy." He told her everything. He kept his voice low and steady, recounting the events with a factual precision that he hoped would counteract the sheer insanity of the story. He told her about the foreclosure, the blizzard, the arrival of Titan and the foals, the visit from Graves, the brand, the tag, the siege, and the arrival of the herd. He described the rifle he now held in his hands. He finished, his throat dry, and waited for her response. The silence on the other end of the line was a vast, empty canyon. "Dad," she finally said, her voice trembling. "Oh, Dad, I'm coming to get you. You need help. This grief is making you see things. Let me help you." It was exactly what he had feared, the dismissal, the pity. "Lily, it's real, I have proof." "The rifle, Dad, you could have found that anywhere. Please just stay there." "I'll be there in a few hours. We can call Dr. Evans." "No," he shouted, the force of it surprising them both. "No doctors, no sheriffs, just trust me. For once in your life, trust me." He hung up, his hand shaking. He had failed. He had pushed her away, confirmed her worst fears. He was alone in this. He had made a terrible mistake. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that Sterling Biogen would not have made the same one. They would have found her first. Miles away, in a sterile, glass-walled office overlooking a city skyline, Alistair Sterling, CEO of Sterling Biogen, slammed a tablet down on his marble desk. The screen spiderwebbed with cracks. "A dozen of my best men, $100 million in equipment, repelled by an old man and a horse." He snarled at the holographic image of Mr. Graves shimmering in the air before him. Graves's image remained impassive. "It was more than one horse, sir. It was an entire herd. We were overwhelmed by a coordinated, tactical assault. We have never seen this level of intelligence or aggression in the other specimens. The other specimens are failures. Caged, psychotic, or dead," Sterling roared, his face purpling. XB7 was the only stable one, the key to the entire program. The military contracts, the agricultural patents, everything depends on recovering that animal and its offspring. "Find me a weakness, find me leverage, I don't care what it costs, I want my property back." Graves's cold eyes flickered. "We've already found one, sir. The old man has a daughter, an estranged daughter, name's Lily Thorne. Lives in the city, works as a paralegal. According to our social media scans, she believes her father is suffering from depression and post-traumatic stress. She's vulnerable." Sterling's anger subsided, replaced by a cold, reptilian smile. "Well then," he said softly, "it sounds like Miss Thorne is about to receive a very generous and concerned visitor. Frame it as an intervention. Tell her we're a private healthcare group worried about her father's erratic behavior, that we're here to help. Get her on our side. The old man won't fire on his own little girl." The game had changed. The assault would no longer be on a ranch house of wood and stone, but on a relationship of love and doubt. Elias waited. The day after his call with Lily was the longest of his life. Every passing hour was a new torment. He expected the black SUVs to return, expected a full-scale assault, but nothing came. The silence was more unnerving than the threat of violence. He watched the herd, took comfort in their quiet strength. Titan stayed by his side, a silent confidant, sensing his master's turmoil. The foals, oblivious, played in the living room, their innocent joy a painful reminder of what was at stake. Late in the afternoon, a single, unfamiliar car appeared at the bottom of his driveway. It wasn't a black SUV. It was a sensible blue sedan, Lily's car. His heart leaped and sank in the same instant. She had come, but she wasn't alone. A man in a tailored suit got out of the passenger side. He was handsome, with a reassuring smile and kind eyes. He carried a leather briefcase. Elias watched from the window, the shotgun in his hands feeling impossibly heavy. Titan moved to stand beside him, letting out a low, warning rumble. Lily and the man walked toward the house, their steps hesitant in the deep snow. "Dad," Lily called out, her voice strained. "Dad, please open the door. This is Dr. Aris. He's here to help us. He's a specialist." Elias' blood ran cold. Dr. Aris. He had the same cold, dead eyes as graves. He was one of them. They had gotten to her. They had twisted her love and concern into a weapon to be used against him. "Stay back, Lily," he yelled through the door. "He's not a doctor, he's with them." "Dad, you're not making any sense," she cried, tears in her voice. "Please just talk to him. He understands what you've been through. He can help you process." "Lily, he is lying to you." Elias felt a wave of desperation wash over him. How could he make her see? He was trapped. If he opened the door, they had him. If he didn't, he proved their point, cementing in Lily's mind that he was a paranoid, dangerous recluse. It was a perfect trap. The man, Aris, stepped forward, his smile unwavering. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice calm and reasonable, amplified by the clear, cold air. "My name is Arthur Aris. I'm with a private foundation that helps rural families in crisis. We were alerted to your situation, the financial distress, the recent reports of erratic behavior. We want to help. We can pay off the bank. We can secure this land for you. All we ask is that you cooperate with a simple wellness check." It was a brilliant move. They were offering him everything he had lost, a way out of the crushing debt. All he had to do was surrender the horses, surrender his soul. "He's lying, Lily. They want the horses." "What horses, Dad?" she sobbed, her confusion and fear palpable. "There are no horses. Please just open the door." He looked back into the room. Titan stood watching him, his intelligent eyes full of understanding. The stallion knew what was happening. He knew that the greatest threat was not the men with guns, but the woman with a key to Elias' heart. Elias made a decision. He couldn't convince her with words. He had to show her. "All right," he called out, his voice hoarse. "I'll open the door, but you come in alone, Lily. He stays on the porch." There was a muffled conversation. Aris nodded reassuringly to Lily. She took a deep breath and walked to the door. Elias unbolted it and opened it just enough for her to slip inside. The moment she was through, he slammed it shut, bolting it again, leaving Aris on the porch. Lily stood in the ruined living room, her eyes wide with shock at the destruction. "Dad, what happened here?" she whispered. "Where are they?" Elias asked, his voice low and urgent. "The other men. The ones in black." "There are no other men," she insisted. "It's just us, just me and Dr. Aris." Then she saw him. Titan stepped out from the shadows of the kitchen doorway, silent as a wraith. He was larger and more magnificent than she could have ever imagined. He was impossible. Lily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes locked on the creature from a fairy tale. Her carefully constructed reality shattered into a million pieces. The stories were true. Her father wasn't crazy. Standing beside the impossible stallion, the two foals peeked out from behind his legs, their eyes wide with curiosity. "You see," Elias whispered, his heart aching with a mixture of vindication and sorrow. "I told you." Before Lily could process, Aris's voice came through the door, no longer calm and reassuring, but cold and hard as steel. "You have 5 minutes, Thorne. Give us the girl and the assets, or we burn the house to the ground. Your choice." Outside, emerging from the woods where they had been hiding, a dozen men in black tactical gear appeared, their weapons trained on the small, isolated ranch house. The intervention was over. The siege had begun anew. Lily stared at her father, her face pale, a storm of confusion, fear, and dawning comprehension in her eyes. They used me," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "They told me you were a danger to yourself. They said they wanted to help." "They want him," Elias said, nodding toward Titan, who stood like a stone statue, his gaze fixed on the door. "And they'll go through us to get him." From outside, Aris's voice, now stripped of all pretense, echoed again. 4 minutes, Thorne. I imagine that old wood will catch fire quite nicely." Lily's paralysis broke, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. The city paralegal, accustomed to battles fought with paperwork and legal precedent, was now in a literal war zone. "The cellar," she said, her voice sharp and focused. "The old storm cellar. The entrance is in the pantry behind the shelves. It leads out to the gully behind the barn. Granddad showed me when I was a kid. Can they fit?" Elias looked at Titan's massive frame. "He will. The foals definitely. We have to try." He grabbed the shotgun and a box of shells. Lily, her mind now working with a cold clarity, ran to the pantry and began pulling away the heavy shelves of canned goods her mother had put up years ago. Behind them, obscured by dust and cobwebs, was a heavy, iron-ringed trapdoor. Together they heaved it open, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into the damp, earthy darkness. "Go," Elias grunted at Titan. "Get them down there." The stallion, understanding instantly, nudged the foals toward the opening. The filly went without protest, but the colt balked, frightened by the dark, unfamiliar hole. Titan nudged him more forcefully, a low, commanding nicker rumbling in his chest, and the colt scrambled down the steps. Titan followed, his massive frame barely squeezing through the opening. "Your turn," Elias said to Lily. "I'll hold them off as long as I can." "No," she said, her jaw set with a stubbornness he recognized as his own. "We go together. They don't want to burn the house, not really. They want the horses alive. They're bluffing." Before he could argue, the crack of a high-powered rifle echoed, and a canister smashed through the living room window, spewing a thick, acrid smoke. "Tear gas," Lily choked, her eyes streaming. They scrambled for the cellar, Elias pulling the heavy door down just as the first black-clad mercenaries smashed through the front and back entrances. They plunged into darkness, the sounds of the raid muffled above them. They navigated the narrow, dirt-walled tunnel by touch, Lily leading the way, Elias bringing up the rear. The horses were surprisingly quiet, moving with a careful, deliberate slowness. They emerged from the far end of the tunnel into the biting cold of the gully, hidden from the house by a thick stand of pine trees. From their hiding place, they watched as the mercenaries stormed the empty house, their movements precise and brutal. A moment later, Graves emerged from the house, his face a mask of cold fury. He spoke into his radio. "They're gone. There's a tunnel there on foot. Deploy the drones. Full thermal sweep. I want them found." The fight wasn't over. It had just moved to a new battlefield. This was no longer just Elias' fight. It was his daughter's, too. And as they huddled in the freezing gully, the bond between them, frayed by years of grief and misunderstanding, began to knit itself back together in the crucible of shared danger. They were a family again, a family of outlaws on the run, hunted by a relentless, faceless enemy, with only an impossible creature and his two children as their allies. The odds were impossible, but for the first time in a long time, Elias Thorne felt like he had something worth fighting for. And this time, he wasn't fighting alone. And so, their destiny was forged, a new legacy built from the ashes of the old. Their story now belongs to time, but its power only grows if shared. Sometimes, saving a life is the only way to save your own, for in defending the vulnerable, we find the truest measure of our own strength. But as one man breaks the system that tried to crush him, another is trapped by it. What happens when the cage you're in isn't made of iron bars, but of pure gold? If this journey marked your soul, leave a like and subscribe. For the best stories are those that refuse to die in silence.